Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Friday, February 28th, day 511 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter Lazer Berman for a brief Friday news update, followed by a full episode of our regularly scheduled Friday Focus podcast. Hi, Lazer. Thanks for joining me this morning.
Hi, Amanda. Good morning.
Good morning. A teen is in critical condition after a terror suspect plowed into a bus stop, injuring 13. The IDF has begun to release its probes into what led up to its widespread October 7th failures and how things went tragically wrong on that day. And Israel has sent a negotiating team to Cairo. We'll discuss all of this, followed by our Friday Focus podcast. Lazer, let's start with last evening's bus stop attack, and a Palestinian man steered his car into a crowd of people waiting at a bus stop in northern Israel in what is considered to be a terror spree that left 13 people injured, including a 17-year-old girl who is fighting for her life. So what do we know about the perpetrator so far?
So he's a Palestinian man. He's from Jenin, which is the city in the northern part of the West Bank, very close to the border with Israel. He was living in Israel, actually, against the law, but he has an Arab-Israeli wife. So that's how he managed to live inside of Israel. And footage shows him driving past this bus stop, swerving with his car into the bus stop, hitting people, and then swerving back into the highway and continuing on. So I think there's little doubt in people's minds from the footage what his intentions were.
He was neutralized at the scene, as I understand it.
Yes. Yep. Police shot him at the scene. So you're not going to get any information out of any interrogation, but I think the footage makes it pretty clear what this was.
Last night, the IDF presented its top-level investigations into the military's failures during the lead-up to the Hamas terror group's October 7th, 2023 onslaught, and on the day itself. To remind listeners, some 5,000 Hamas-led terrorists from the Gaza Strip burst into southern Israel on October 7th, carrying out a murderous rampage of unprecedented intensity and breadth and duration. The IDF struggled to mount a response. Its own probes now specify, with bases closest to the border overrun and the chain of command broken amid the chaos. The attack claimed the lives of some 1,200 people in Israel, with another 251 kidnapped and much of the area devastated. Most of the victims were civilians. So, Lazer, I'll speak with our military reporter Emmanuel Fabian about the details of the probes so far. There are more probes to be released. In an upcoming episode, we'll talk all of this through. But today, I just want to hear what broad strokes are your quick takeaways.
Yeah, so a question that I get all the time when I'm talking about October 7th is, how does this happen? It was certainly something that was unimaginable beforehand. And once it happened, I think it took a long time for people to kind of accept the fact that it's even possible within the realm of reality that a mighty military like the IDF was defeated, at least for a while, by a terror organization like Hamas. You saw images of just people on motorcycles and civilians, someone with a cane coming across the border, and bringing back 251 hostages and bringing the whole region into what we've been involved in for the past almost year and a half. This starts to explain a lot of it. Some of it was an intelligence concept that just could not imagine that something like this would happen. Just inadequate risk assessment, saying even if we don't think it's going to happen, how do we make sure that even if something does happen that we don't think is likely to happen, that we are properly prepared for it? And some problematic decision making in the early hours. Obviously, we know by the end of the day, the situation was very different and it was starting to come back under control. But you can see how you get something wrong even for a couple of hours, and then the whole future of the country and the region is changed. So it shows what's at stake here.
It's not just one decision, it's a collection of decisions. And this is something that obviously took even perhaps decades to lead up to, because as you said, it's a problem of the conception, it's a problem of listening, it's a problem of considering other options. And do you think, Lazer, that based on what happened on October 7th, that the IDF is making some kind of course correction already?
Yeah, I mean, you can see how aggressive Israel is being on its borders. Let's say in Syria, they're saying, we will not accept the Syrian army south of Damascus and Lebanon. You can see that we're continuing to enforce what we want to see on the border, even though there's a ceasefire. You can see with the aggressive operations in the West Bank. So I think on letting threats emerge on our borders, we're going to be aggressive about that. But surprise attacks will always happen. Our enemies are not stupid. They understand where they're able to find our weak points and our Achilles heels, and they'll continue to do that. And we just have to understand that we need the right people in place in the military. We need a military that is focused 100% on its job of protecting us and being lethal and not involved in any other sorts of things. Like, the IDF has a lot of things that it spends money on that aren't necessarily those things. So I'm not sure that's the best use of money. And the decision makers have to understand, political decision makers have to understand that they are surrounded by threats, and their decisions, if they get it right, it could ensure our peace and prosperity for a long time to come. And if they get it wrong, we could find ourselves facing another surprise in which thousands of people and more are affected. So I think in these specific problems, we've already seen a lot of course correction, but there's plenty of other places where you can see where there's reason to worry.
Yesterday, an Israeli delegation arrived in Cairo for quote-unquote intensive talks on the next stages of the Gaza hostage-ceasefire deal, joining mediators from the US and Qatar. So, Lazer, what are the goals of these talks as far as you know?
So it depends who you're asking. The Egyptians and Qataris would like to see a move to phase 2. The Egyptians would like to see the future of Gaza based on the program that they're going to present at the Arab Summit on March 4th. So that's next week. I'm sure the Qataris, who knows what they want, actually. They're certainly enjoying being mediators, but I think their main interest is to continue to play the central role and be seen as an effective mediator for the West. Israel does not want to move to the second phase. Israel is trying to extend the first phase, meaning that as long as Hamas feels like it has to keep releasing hostages and Israel doesn't have to commit to the end of the war, then Israel is willing to do that until everyone's home. And so that's Israel's goal right now. Try to get Hamas to release more hostages within the week and make it understand that if it doesn't, then it faces war again. So I think we're at a very critical time because the first phase is ending, the second phase is not beginning, and Israel's trying to maximize the fact that Hamas is in a very, very weak position right now and to get more hostages home.
In this in-between time, Lazer and I discussed on our Friday Focus podcast series the backstory of the hostage release negotiations, and we talk about where they may go from here. So listeners, please stay with us for a full episode of our Friday Focus podcast series. It now has its own podcast channel. Did you know that, Lazer? You can find Friday Focus on Spotify, on all the Apple podcasts, on everything on its own, Friday Focus.
I did not know that because no one tells me anything, but I will be sure to check it out and send it to everyone I know.
Need to know, Lazer. So, Lazer, thank you so much for joining me this Friday morning, and may you have a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Today is Friday, February 28th. Day 511 of the war. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazer Berman. Lazer, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here.
Always so wonderful to chat with you. And today I'm going to pick your brain. I know people hate that expression, but I'm going to pick your brain because we're at a point in terms of the hostage release / ceasefire talks that I just really want to pause and understand what has been happening before I understand what may happen or hopefully will happen. So let's discuss all of this and much, much more after the break. And we're back. Lazer, let's do the time warp and let's go back to October 8th, 2023. And let's start talking about who were the first main players that were trying to get our hostages out and limit at least what would happen in terms of Israeli retaliation.
Okay, so let me stress, first of all, I think, if you go back to the coverage of that time, you could do it, on Times of Israel site. you'll see that no one knew how many hostages were taken. We were reporting dozens. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad were talking about, I believe they're talking about 130 the next day. Obviously, we know it was over 250. And there was not a clear sense of what Israel was going to do. In those first days, there was no sense that there was going to be any negotiation. You had Tzachi Hanegbi, who is the national security advisor, saying, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. You had plenty of world leaders saying that we don't support a ceasefire right now. So in those early days, it was not clear at all that there was going to be any sort of process. And let's remember something else. In terms of the war aims, the idea of bringing back all the hostages as a war aim was only added a couple of weeks in. It was not in the initial war goals. So it took a while for Israel and the world to understand what exactly the situation was, who was being held. It wasn't only Israelis, it was from a bunch of countries, and what the policy was going to be. And I think that's very important. Netanyahu met with families, I believe it was October 15th. So we're talking 8 days after that terrible day. That's a day after Hanegbi had said, we're not going to have negotiations right now. And he met with hostage families. And I think that's when there was starting to be the hostage family movement, let's call it, even though there's several wings and several movements, kind of came together and understood that we need to start putting pressure on the government to make them see efforts to release hostages as one of the key war aims. Before that, there were some press conferences. I was at one a couple of days after October 7th by American citizen families.
Including Hersh Goldberg, Poland, of course.
Yeah, both his parents and Jonathan Dekelchen. So these are people that have become very well known for their efforts, for their strength, for their pain in the case of the Polands. And I remember, it was kind of this sense of what are we going to do? What is our plan going to be? Some families flew very early to the US to press the Biden administration, but that was kind of amorphous in the beginning.
It did feel like to me, Laser, even from the beginning, that anyone who had some kind of dual citizenship was immediately turning to their other citizenship, meaning not just to the Israeli government. And that's the case, of course, of the US citizens, such as Hersh Goldberg, Poland, who was, of course, slain in Gaza. And that's the case of even Elgarat, whose body was returned very recently at the close of phase 1 of the current ceasefire hostage release deal. He's a Danish citizen as well. And
Yalomi is French.
Yalomi is French. So many of the Israelis who were captured, I don't know, it could be even the majority have some other citizenship. And those citizenships were being leveraged really early on, I felt like.
Yeah, and it wasn't only dual citizens. There was so many Thai workers, you had a Tanzanian student, Nepalese, Russians, plenty of French. So some of them were dual citizens, but some were just here working or as students. So it was really an international incident, not to mention all the Argentinians that lived on the border, kibbutzim. So it took a while to kind of coalesce about what is going to happen. And there was a sense that you weren't going to stop Israel from starting the ground offensive, and that Hamas really was not interested in some sort of deal at the beginning because they didn't think Israel was really going to go in on the ground. I mean, certainly we gave them every reason in recent decades to believe that we were afraid of doing that. And I think we were to some extent. A initial ceasefire came about actually pretty early. Once it was clear how aggressive, I don't want to say we're aggressive, but how serious we were about that ground maneuver. And it was really significant fighting. It was just Gaza City on the ground. So you had 4 divisions maneuvering around Gaza City. I was in Gaza City for some of that fighting, briefly. I wasn't taking any serious part of the Gaza City part, but I was already called up and went in one night. It wasn't where my division was stationed, but I was just going in kind of to prepare for what we would be doing. And yeah, absolutely, it was unbelievable amount of fighting. Just everywhere you look, everywhere you listen, just gunfire all night. And I think that shocked Hamas, and it made them realize that they needed a break here. And that's what led to a ceasefire that was announced on November 22nd.
But even prior to that, Laser, there were the I call them in my head at least, there were the random releases. There was the mother and daughter U.S. citizens, and then there were the two elderly ladies.
Yeah,
who were
Vivian
released.
Silver. Yeah, so there was a couple, that, right, it was, I think also Hamas was trying to understand, they were surprised by how many hostages they had grabbed. I think their allies in the Arab world, including Qatar and Turkey, were pretty embarrassed and furious at them too, because they had dragged them into this now. And at that time, the world's anger and shock was against Hamas and not against Israel yet. So they were trying to figure out how much pressure that would release if they released a couple. Obviously, they were still, let's not forget, they were still holding kids at the time. The Bibas kids, according to Israel, were still alive. But that's who they chose to release. It didn't really release any pressure on them. Israel continued with the ground invasion. And they understood that they really needed a break. What the initial agreement would be a 4-day pause in which you would see 50 Israeli hostages go free, women and children, 150 Palestinian prisoners, more humanitarian aid going into Gaza. That started on November 24th. It was extended twice. So you had two 24-hour extensions where 10 more it was supposed to be 10 more came out. It didn't always happen. And then on November 30th, it fell apart.
But wasn't there also a big van load of Thai workers who were set free at that point too?
Yep, there was also, I forget how many, I think it was 13, it could have been even more. But yeah, there was a significant number of Thai workers that came out in parallel. Obviously, we had another release in the ongoing one of some more Thai workers that have since flown back home. But
ongoing until tomorrow, until Shabbat.
Yeah, it's true. We'll see what happens, but it could be extended. But we'll talk about that. But yeah, so that was the initial one. It came out later, and I've reported on this, that why did Israel decide to stop those releases? Because if you look at it now, a 24-hour pause in a war for 10 hostages is wonderful. Now we're doing a week long for 3 or 4, including bodies. So why would we stop that at the time? Hamas gave a list of what it said were dead hostages that was willing to return. And Israel knew for certain, based on intelligence, that those hostages were still alive. And they understood if they said yes to the next day of releases, it would likely mean that Hamas was going to kill living hostages and give them back as bodies. Noor Argamani was on that list. So if Israel had said yes at the time, and the government came under significant criticism for months that they had stopped that deal, turned out there was things that we didn't know. It didn't come out until a few months ago. That's when I was able to report that. But that's why that deal fell apart. After that, it was back to war. The focus moved from Gaza City to Khan Yunis, Division 98. That's what I was in. And that's where the fighting continued. And that was really the height of the campaign against Hamas. From December, there was attempts led by Qatar, and Qatar's prime minister actually said in recent weeks that basically the idea, this is what he claims, the idea of a phased agreement basically came about in December. It just took a while.
December of 2023. 2023.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And it just took a long time before, it started to get movement. I think what was happening in Hamas's mind was, okay, they felt like they were able to play the increased international pressure on Israel because Khan Yunis, okay, the death toll was growing. But then what really happened was when Israel started to focus on Rafah, on that southern city, that's when you had the US administration really giving these threats that I would say, and I think there's plenty of reason to believe this, gave a lot of hope to Hamas, that the longer we wait, the more international pressure. And once you have the Biden administration basically saying don't to Israel, then they thought that would really be a way for them to withstand it. Let's also not forget, this is when the fighting was going on between Hezbollah and Israel, but it seemed like the Hezbollah threat, I don't even say seemed like, it was true. The threat of that massive rocket arsenal was deterring Israel from doing much. So they thought that was another card that could be played to save them. And also Iran hadn't struck yet, right? So Hamas was thinking, okay, we have international pressure. We have domestic pressure building on this coalition, pushing for another hostage deal. And we have Hezbollah and we have Iran. The Houthis were starting a little bit. There's no reason to move toward a deal.
Let's talk about who are the players who actually made the first big deal go through. Was it US, Qatar, Egypt, as we're seeing now, or was Egypt in the mix then?
Egypt's always in the mix for anything that happens in the Gaza Strip for a number of reasons. First of all, the security and intelligence relationship is so close between Israel and Egypt, incredibly close, especially once Israel starts operating in Rafah. Anything that happens near the border, Egypt has to know so it can move its troops back. It's that close. I don't want to go into too much detail, but this is a really close relationship. But also, they're the ones on the border. They have a ton of leverage, or also contacts. Their leverage can change depending on the circumstances over Hamas. Qatar obviously is crucial, not necessarily always in our interest, but the fact that they have Hamas's political leadership abroad hosted there, that gives them serious leverage as well. Turkey tried to insinuate themselves as well. There's Hamas offices in Turkey. Turkey doesn't consider them a terrorist organization. But there was really no reason for us to bring Turkey into the mix. We know how hostile the Erdogan government has been toward Israel. Usually there's been some ups and downs, but now it's just, throughout the war, he's been really leading the push against Israel, at least rhetorically. So there was no reason to bring them involved. Other countries who had nationals were involved quietly. So the French were obviously interested, the British, they weren't dominant players. The Russians at times.
Right. And there was that random Russian release as well, if you remember, in November, right? November 2023.
There was one Russian Israeli who was released. And then they have had plenty of citizens. So Sasha Trufanov, who was released a couple of weeks ago, also a Russian Israeli. And so that gave them an additional interest there. We know what Russia is. We know they support Iran, they support Syria, they support plenty of Israel's enemies, but there is a working relationship there. So it's certainly another tool that we could use.
So in terms of who is on our side completely, it kind of sounds to me like it would be the US. But of course, during the Biden administration, as you were saying, we got to the point with Rafah where it did seem that Biden was waving his finger and saying, don't, to us, to the Israelis. And so who is speaking for the Israelis? Who is leading our team? Who is representing us?
Well, yeah, so obviously the U.S. backs Israel. It certainly doesn't back Hamas, but I think you're right that in their attempts to, I think a lot of it was because of the elections, a lot of it because internal fights within the Democratic Party. Biden himself certainly is very sympathetic to Israel, but there was a lot of pushback within the party, especially as the elections got closer. Why are we going to put Trump back in the Oval Office for this guy Netanyahu, who we don't like, who blasted Obama in Congress? This is not something you want to do. So they tried to play both sides. They would criticize Israel, but I think they were really there was an American interest to end the war. That was a decision made at some point. But they kept giving Hamas hope by being willing to publicly air criticism of Israel. So I think you can hear my criticism of that. And I think the administration realized that as well after the election. They were singing a very different tune before Trump came into office. Who was leading the negotiations on Israel's side? It was basically the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, and the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar. They brought Brigadier General Gal Hirsch in to head the Prime Minister's office, contact and strategizing with the hostage families and also on the hostage talks as general. So he was a key player. And the IDF's point man was retired or reservist General Nitzan Alon, who had been the head of the Central Command, and he was a key player there as well. So those were the ones leading it. Obviously, National Security Council, an important player. Ron Dermer also was part of this, but those are the main heads of it. It's basically lived in the among the security organizations. Of course, there was plenty of meetings so that the Prime Minister and his advisors could give directives, but that's who led on Israel's part.
And that's in the past. And right now we're seeing a shift in leadership on Israel's part. And do you think this will cause a shift in thinking and perhaps a different kind of strategy?
It's not the only thing. I don't think that's decisive, but there's no question that the situation now is very different because it's not an attempt to reach a deal, which went on for months, right? The better part of a year from November till January. The situation is different now because we have a deal. We have the Trump administration. We are trying to get the most out of a first phase. We're trying to stay coordinated with the Trump administration, but I think the understanding is it's either Hamas gives up or we go back to war. So it's a very different context. At the time, it was, if you remember, over the summer, it was a lot of, shuttling to Qatar, shuttling to Egypt, hopes growing, hopes collapsing as things went along. But it's a very different situation now. So I think it's not only that Ron Dermer is taking a more the leadership role there. It's the fact that the context is very different.
Because just to spell it out a little bit more, there's no ambivalence, it sounds like, on the side of our one ally, the United States.
That's an important part as well. But also, I think there's much fewer hostages. And we understand that we can go back to war. We've gotten out many, many hostages, and we see that there's opportunities to get more. It's important to understand also that Hamas's position is weakened. We're talking about when they had all those hopes. And over the summer, let's talk about what happened over the last summer. In May, there was that staged plan that Israel and the U.S. worked out. Biden calls it kind of the Netanyahu's proposal that was given. May 27th is the big date there. And then I believe it was May 31st. But first, Biden gave that big speech where he laid it out publicly. He says, well, what's the problem with me laying it out? It's Israel's plan, but it was also to put Israel a bit in a corner. Nothing really happened with that. Hamas gave its response on July 27th with some amendments. But there was also in July, Netanyahu was criticized for adding 4 of his own amendments about not leaving the Philadelphia corridor, not leaving the Rafah crossing, Nitzarim. And that was seen as adding new obstacles for the deal. But even so, at the time, there wasn't movement. What changed? What changed, I think, was in September, October, there was the attack that killed 12 Jewish children in Majd al-Shams on the Golan Heights. Israel decided that we are going to war now against Hezbollah. And the success of that campaign, the beeper walkie-talkie attacks, killing Nasrallah, killing Safi ad-Din, his deputy, killing the Radwan leadership, having such a unobstructed campaign on the ground, knocked Hezbollah out of the fight, and Hamas understood it's really alone. You had the 2 Iranian attacks, which added up to not much, basically nothing. With the fall of the Assad regime, Hamas was alone. You also had the killing of Sinwar, who was seen as obviously kind of a fanatic obstructionist who kept thinking that he could somehow pull out a victory here. You put all those things together with the addition of the Trump victory in November, Hamas's position absolutely collapsed, and then they were willing to show flexibility and to grab what was available back in May.
Okay, I know you have to run, but I really have always wanted to ask this of you on air. You have a briefing, I know, so very briefly.
I have a press conference.
Sorry. Very briefly, why should Israel be negotiating with terrorists to begin with? Israel obviously is so much stronger in terms of military prowess, not to mention other things that international media reports on. Why should Israel be in this position to begin with, this kind of begging position to get our people back?
Well, we're in this position because we failed to defend our border and protect them on October 7th. So we allowed ourselves to be put in a very, very compromised position. We have a policy of negotiating with terrorists. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Starting in 1985 with the Jibril deal, where we released hardened terrorists, not from Hamas, from the PFLP, in exchange for 3 Israeli soldiers who were taken captive in the First Lebanon War. That started the precedent that we are willing to release a lot of people. And you look over the years, we keep on doing it again and again. We did it with Hezbollah. I believe there was one in 2004 for Tenenbaum and 3 soldiers that were killed on Har Dov in 2000. 2008, you had another release. Obviously, the Gilad Shalit one, that was massive. That was for 1 soldier who was taken in 2006. 2011, we released 1,027, including Yahya Sinwar, but we still did it, right? So it's something that we do again and again. Does everyone do it? Does America, who's been pushing us for this deal, to do it? No, let's not forget. During the Obama administration, so this isn't some right-wing, militant administration, ISIS took about 20 Western captives. I think there was 4 Americans that they ended up killing. Who were they asking for? They were basically asking for a few $1 million for each one. And you can imagine what a small price to pay. European countries did, right? But the US and UK said, we're not doing it. And those hostages, sadly, we know what happened. They were beheaded on camera. So the U.S., in the past, there have been negotiations, whether you want to talk about Iran-Contra under Reagan. It has happened, but in general, they're much tougher about not negotiating with terrorists. You could say that's because different values, because they're obviously much more powerful, but there's plenty of people here who understand it is a bad idea to negotiate with terrorists. If we hadn't done it in 85, would we be in the situation we are now? I'm not sure. That people have to ask themselves, but we always keep telling ourselves, this is the last time we're going to do it, and next time we're not going to. If, God forbid, we let our guard down and more hostages are taken, I think we've taught our enemies again and again that for their interests, you take hostages, you get a lot in return. And we have to think, are we a society that has what it takes to stop doing that? Or is this something that we are going to live with because this is how we want to manage the fact that that people take hostages and we want to get them back?
Just one more minute, Laser.
Sure.
Now wearing your chaplain's hat from your university experience, isn't negotiating for hostages a Jewish value?
It is, but I for complex questions, it's often hard to say what exactly is the Jewish value that you should be pointing at here, because there's also Jewish value of protecting human life. And so that could mean let's get the person in danger right now out, but at the same time, knowing that we're going to be endangering people in the future, how do you balance that? And there's also restrictions on how much you can pay for a Jewish hostage, because you don't want to encourage it in the future. Massive amounts of ransoms were paid in the past, including Europe in the Middle Ages, because they knew that Jewish communities would pay if their rabbis or whoever were taken hostage. But I don't think there's one clear answer, and anyone that tells you that there is not being honest about it.
Laser, thank you for your honesty, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus, also our daily briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.